In previous videos, I mentioned the difference between the Boolean and the Aristotelian standpoints when it comes to existential import. So in this video, I am going to explain that in a little bit more detail so that you can understand the difference between these two viewpoints. So let us first consider this immediate inference. Is it valid? We have a premise, all puppies are cutie pies, and a conclusion, some puppies are cutie pies. Does this seem like a good inference? Is it valid? We think of validity. If the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true, or it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. And in this case, it might seem at first glance that this must be valid, because if all puppies are cutie pies, that means that some of the puppies have to be cutie pies too, right? Well, according to the Boolean standpoint, this is not valid. We could check it with both of the methods that we've learned so far, with the square of opposition or with Venn diagrams, and neither one of these are we going to get a valid inference. For instance, if you were to draw the Venn diagrams for these, you would have a shaded area in the left-hand side of your diagram for the premise, and you would have an X in the middle of the diagram for your conclusion. Those don't match, so this is not a valid inference. Or if we were thinking about this from the square of opposition, starting in the upper left-hand corner, you have all puppies are cutie pies is true, and then you're supposed to go down from the A proposition to the I proposition, but according to the Boolean standpoint, that's logically undetermined. So this is not a valid inference. The reason why is because of how Boole interpreted these statements. So we need to review what Boole thought of when he thought of these kinds of statements. Look, consider A there. That's an A proposition. All puppies are cutie pies. What this literally means, according to Boole, is no members of the puppies category exists outside of the cutie pie category. And when we look at our conclusion from the immediate inference, what this literally means is at least one puppy exists, and that puppy is a cutie pie. Now notice the difference between these two. In the first statement, when we think about what that is supposed to be equivalent to, it's not telling us anything that exists. It's only telling us what does not exist. There are no puppies. No puppies exist outside of the cutie pie category. But then in B, we are told that a puppy does exist. So when it comes to existential import, this is what we're talking about. Whether or not a statement implies the existence of something. So from the Boolean standpoint, all universal propositions, like we have here, do not imply the existence of anything. They only tell you what doesn't exist. When it comes to particular propositions, they do have existential import because they imply that something exists. At least one thing exists. So when we have an argument like this, it commits what's called the existential fallacy, going from a premise that does not commit us to the existence of anything to a conclusion that does commit us to the existence of something. So just think about this. Our premise is telling us something that does not exist, and then our conclusion is telling us something that does exist. So it's kind of like thinking about making an inference. Like you walk into a room and it's completely empty except for a box. And you start with your premise, well, nothing exists outside of the box in this room. And then trying to conclude, well, that means something must exist inside of the box. Well, that's not a good inference. You can't tell anything about what exists inside of the box just from the fact that nothing exists outside of the box. And we can think about this in the same way. These universal propositions, according to Boole, are kind of like that idea of nothing existing outside of the box, because this is what he means with these kinds of propositions. No puppies exist outside of the cutie pie category. That's all it means. But then we're supposed to be able to go from that to a conclusion that implies the existence of something. At least one thing exists inside of that category. According to Boole, any argument with a universal premise and a particular conclusion is going to commit the existential fallacy for this same reason. Okay, now let's look at the difference between Boole and Aristotle when it comes to existential import. So when we see a statement like this, the one that we've been considering, all puppies are cutie pies, from the Aristotelian perspective, this denotes actually existing things. So remember when we talked about denotation before the break, denotation refers to extension, things that are out in the world, things that you can point to. And so when you have a proposition like this, it denotes or implies, or we can think of it as pointing to the actually existing things that are out in the world. Since we're talking about something that actually exists, in this case puppies, we know that this has existential import. So we could translate this. This is one of the main differences between Boole and Aristotle. When it comes to universal propositions, Boole said that all they mean is, or all they commit us to, is nothing existing in a certain area in that diagram. So remember the Venn diagram. We shaded in an area of the Venn diagram for universal propositions. And the shading in the diagram means nothing exists in that area, and that's all those statements mean. Well, Aristotle, the Aristotelian perspective at least, differs in the Boolean perspective because we have a different kind of translation. So it's a different interpretation of these universal statements. The interpretation is that puppies exist and they are all in the cutie pie category. Now, because of this difference in translation, we're going to have a difference in whether or not these types of immediate inferences are valid. So notice, when we had the same inference from the Boolean perspective, we came to the conclusion that it was invalid. From the Aristotelian perspective, because the Aristotelian perspective differs on how to interpret universal propositions, this argument is going to be valid, because notice how we're translating this. All puppies are cutie pies literally means puppies exist and they're all in the cutie pie category. And then we go from that premise to a conclusion, some puppies are cutie pies, which means exactly the same thing it did from the Boolean perspective as it does for the Aristotelian perspective. At least one puppy exists in the cutie pie category. Now, we're not making the same invalid inference from the Aristotelian perspective as we were from the Boolean perspective because of the way that we're interpreting that first premise, or the only premise in this case. Previously, the reason why Boole thought that this commits the existential fallacy is because we had a premise that says nothing exists and a conclusion that says at least one thing exists. Now we've got a premise that says puppies exist and they're in the cutie pie category, and the conclusion that says at least one puppy exists in the cutie pie category. And of course that's a valid inference when you interpret universal propositions in this way. So this is the main difference between Aristotle and Boole when it comes to existential import. This is a valid inference. All right, now what about this? All dragons are fire-breathing monsters. Does this have existential import? Are we committed to the existence of dragons? Does this mean dragons exist and they're all fire-breathing monsters? Well, most people know that fire-breathing monster dragons do not exist, and Aristotle agreed. So it does not have existential import. Aristotle takes a more nuanced view of universal propositions. Only universal propositions about existing things have existential import. Universal propositions about things that do not exist, like fire-breathing dragons, do not have existential import. So, according to Boole, let's move on to the next. I'll give you 4 different statements. According to Boole, none of these propositions have existential import. They're all universal, and therefore they all only tell us what does not exist. Nothing exists in a certain area of the Venn diagram, as we saw before, for all 4 of these. That's the Boolean perspective. Aristotle's, the more nuanced view, is that the first 2 of these, all puppies are cutie pies and no lizards are mammals, those have existential import because we're talking about things that actually exist. The third and the fourth one, all dragons are fire-breathing monsters and no hobbits are NBA All-Stars, those do not have existential import because we're talking about things that do not exist. So this is the only tricky part of the difference between Aristotle and Boole. Boole's easy. No universal propositions have existential import. Aristotle, existential import has to do with whether or not the statement is talking about something that actually exists or not. So let's look a little more in detail. This is what we've had so far. For Boole, no universal propositions have existential import. For Aristotle, universal propositions about existing things have existential import. But remember, universal propositions about things that don't exist do not have existential import. Boole and Aristotle agree when it comes to particular propositions. They both interpret particular propositions in exactly the same way. So any particular proposition, whether it's some puppies are cutie pies or some dragons are fire-breathing monsters, they all commit you to the existence of the thing that you're talking about. So Aristotle and Boole agree when it comes to particular propositions. They only disagree when it comes to universal propositions about existing things. So notice what we've said so far. If we're talking about something that doesn't exist, like no dragons are good neighbors or something like that, Aristotle and Boole are going to agree. Those propositions about things that don't exist do not have existential import. But they are going to disagree when it comes to propositions like all puppies are cutie pies that are about things that we know exist. Boole's going to say they do not have existential import, and Aristotle's going to say that they do have existential import. In one of the later videos that I make, I'm going to explain the difference in Venn diagrams and the square of opposition from the Aristotelian standpoint. But for now, that's it.